Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. On this show, we discuss all aspects of executive compensation. Whether you're a compensation committee member, a seasoned compensation professional, or just curious to learn more about executive compensation, then this show is the answer. Each episode brings you a focused and actionable interview on specific topics of executive compensation. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com. In this episode, you'll hear from Virginia Rhodes and Marc Ullman of Meridian Compensation Partners on the topic of should ESG metrics be included in incentive plans.
Let's just start by talking about what is ESG, first of all, and why is it important that companies consider ESG measures in their incentive structures? Marc, go ahead and start us off.
ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and a broad category that picks up a whole host of items. You can understand from the words what some of those things might be picking up. Environmental, social, right now, diversity and inclusion would fit underneath that. Governance, just having good corporate governance practices and policies has been captured by the ESG label. The reason it's important right now is because large institutional investors find it to be important. And they've written many letters on this. Some of them are quite famous. And the reason I think it's important is because the investing public, which is their market, their customer base, thinks it's important. The younger generation are becoming investors themselves. And the current unrest and environmental changes, et cetera, is just elevated in their minds. And so it has trickled up through the large institutional investors and now over to companies, and it's gotten everyone's attention.
Okay, great. Love to hear your take on this as well, Virginia.
We've seen a lot of interest in ESG really over the past couple of years. Investors have been pushing organizations to not only focus on their increased disclosure of ESG, but also ensure that they're thinking about whether incorporating ESG into their incentive plans is something that they should be considering. Not to suggest that a lot of organizations have gone this direction as of yet, but it's something that investors have been pushing.
So when companies are looking at incorporating these ESG structures or these ESG measures into their incentive structure planning, how do they go about selecting which measures they want to focus on? I would imagine that it would be tough for a company to focus on environmental, social, and governance and all the subcategories underneath those. So how do they go about selecting which ones to focus on in their incentive structure?
That's a very big question that's yet to be fully determined. There are many different metrics out there that are still being defined. There's very few benchmark data that you can use to even compare yourself against to know how well you're doing. I think what companies are doing and what they should do is take their time and consider the various metrics out there from various organizations that are promoting different ways of thinking about ESG metrics and making sure that it fits within their business strategy, their model. There's many metrics that just don't work. Take for a financial services institution compared to an energy company. Very different sorts of ESG matters for these two different types of companies. So it has some industry specificity, but it is going to come down to the individual companies, and they're probably going to need to deal with ambiguity around the metrics and may need to do some of their own defining. And I think at the end of the day, there'll be a healthy dose of discretion in terms of how you evaluate performance under many of these measures, not all. Safety is a classic measure that would fall under this, that is well known and tried and true and widely used and can be quantitative, but many of these other measures that fall under this broad category probably will require a healthy dose of discretion at the comp committee and management levels.
It absolutely depends on the business. So what we try to consult our clients around is making sure that if they're talking about ESG, they're identifying a metric that makes sense for their business. So if you're talking utilities or energy, you're talking greenhouse gas emissions. If you're talking consumer products or household goods, you're talking plastics reduction or animal testing. If you're talking broad human capital metrics, you may be looking at D&I, you may be looking at employee engagement, culture results, things like that. So it really focuses on what's important to your business, what's measurable, what can be tracked, and whether you have a baseline or not. And one of the things that most organizations are struggling with is where to start. So it's important for companies to ensure that they have an understanding of what their baseline is on various different ESG metrics, that they're communicating that to their board, and that the organization understands where they're starting from, and also what they're disclosing publicly. So many companies are struggling with the fact that they already have to put out some statistics around sustainability, for example, and we want to make sure that if, for example, they're putting forth a metric and a plan, that we're not contradicting what's already been stated.
I guess once a company figures out which ESG factors that they consider to be important, how do they then go about building that into their incentive structure?
There's not a very large database that we can rely on and say this is how they've done it. I think in many cases they've been added to the overall metrics. They usually are given a weight of maybe 5 or 10 or 15%. It doesn't usually go much higher than that. It's symbolic in signaling importance, so it's meaningful. It's certainly meaningful, but it's not as meaningful as all the other metrics. And I think this gets to the heart of one of the issues, which is how much are investors willing to pay for ES&G metrics? Because it is going to be a balance between more traditional measures of performance that companies have been paying on. And so the more you pay for ES&G, the less you're going to pay for those other metrics. And I think the question that's out there and unanswered is just how much are investors willing to pay for that? And so I think companies are dealing with that. And I think there's some design alternatives that might help companies deal with that to a degree, but that's some of the ambiguity I referred to earlier. Is what's the right amount to put in there? I think that's a hard question for companies to answer, what that weight should be.
In terms of how I've seen it typically structured, often it's in the short-term plan, even though many of the ESG metrics have a longer-term horizon. Organizations have found that it's easier to measure things in chunks as they progress towards a specific goal. So oftentimes it's in the short-term plan, it's a 10% or less carve out or a modifier of the existing awards. What many organizations have done that are using ESG metrics currently have included it as a qualitative metric in a broader list of items that gets reviewed for either an individual performance assessment or some type of strategic basket of initiatives that the organization is working for that particular year. And the nice thing about that is you're able to change the metric year over year based on the changing needs of the organization, as well as some external factors that may come into play.
What I'm hearing is that there's a lot of ambiguity, and the answers to a lot of these questions are really dependent on the specific company, and it's hard to give an overarching answer. So I was wondering if you could maybe give some examples of clients that you've worked with and help them sort through these ESG factors, just so that we have a better idea of how some companies have structured this so that it provides a model for other companies to maybe use when they're thinking about how to structure their incentives.
In no cases do my clients have a carved out portion of their incentive plan dedicated to ES&G. Where there is ES&G metrics, it's just like what Virginia said. It's in the qualitative or strategic piece of individual performance goals. So for CEOs, for top executives, when there is a portion dedicated to a strategic or qualitative set of goals, ES&G are routinely in those categories, and they're disclosed, and it's clear that it's part of the overall reward structure, but it still remains there. The question that companies are dealing with is, do we elevate this more? Do we put it the way we described it as a modifier or carve it out? And I think as the metrics evolve, as companies get a better sense of baseline benchmark data, I think maybe we will see more companies move to it being a dedicated proportion of the plan. But it's just not there for my clients, and it's really a matter of pacing. When do we go there? Everyone's feeling heat to do it. But if you do go to market and look at companies who are doing it today and how do they do it, you just don't see a groundswell yet. You just see a lot of talk right now, and where it is in the individual components still, mostly, at least with my clients.
I've seen several examples of ESG metrics used in both short-term and, frankly, a few in long-term incentive plans, even though, again, it's not a heavy practice. I think the utility sector is ahead of the game in this respect, not surprising given the focus of their businesses on things like a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, reduction of carbon intensity. So there's lots of examples out there in the utility space around emissions reductions, focus on renewable energy products, reporting environmental incidents or events. So that sector seems to be a bit ahead of the game in terms of really focusing the attention of their executives, both in the short-term and the long-term plans, on environmental metrics in particular. On the D&I side, recently the Wells Fargo CEO announced publicly that executives would be evaluated on how much they've increased representation and inclusion of diverse employees, not for next year, but for this year. Quite a statement. It's something, again, that would be more qualitative in nature, but certainly got the attention, I'm sure, of his team. So on the D&I side, we have seen some movement. About 10% of the Fortune 200 currently incorporate a D&I goal, most of them in a qualitative fashion, including it in a list of factors that are used in an assessment of an individual's performance. But this is a topic that we're talking a lot about with committees these days, given the social unrest in the country over the last couple of months. You know, we saw some early adopters, the Uber, Facebook, Intel group that put in D&I metrics even a couple of years back. But mostly that was due to responding to a crisis or troubling statistics or even issues of a hostile work environment. But it's certainly a topic that many committees are discussing. It's absolutely getting play in the boardroom in terms of not only diversity of the workforce, but also board diversity. So I would assume that those discussions will continue. However, the one thing to caution companies about is just because it's an important management initiative doesn't mean it necessarily will make its way into a compensation program. There's a lot of unintended consequences, particularly around a D&I metric, that we want to make sure that companies are aware of. Many companies are hesitant to report or publish any baseline statistics on the topic. There's certainly a concern over even the perception of setting quotas. So having it be a small portion of a plan, which is typically the way that it works, might suggest a lukewarm commitment to the initiative, even though we know that organizations are rallying around this topic around the country. Just because it's something that investors are interested in and want disclosure around doesn't necessarily mean it's right for incentive plans.
I think to get a little deeper into the weeds of what you were just saying, Virginia, with talking through each of the three: environmental, social, and governance. And I know it's hard to give examples because companies haven't really incorporated this, but if a client came to you and wanted to incorporate some environmental initiatives into their compensation structure or some social initiatives, how would you advise that client? What are the steps? Let's just give the reader a very practical walkthrough of what are the things that they should be thinking about as they decide whether to or how to incorporate one of these things.
The first step would be to look inward. So many companies have great sustainability reports that already put forth the primary objectives of the organization and what they're targeting to achieve over the coming year, 2, 5, 10. So really focusing inward on what are those primary objectives, how measurable are they? Because one of the things that we hear from many of our clients is that they have a goal that they want to achieve by 2025 or 2045, but breaking that up into annual increments is difficult. So how measurable is the goal? What are you able to track it? There are a lot of great initiatives that are out there that organizations are rallying around, but they currently don't have the systems in place to track it. D&I is one of those. Not every company, particularly the global ones that have far-reaching employee populations, are currently able to track their diversity and statistics. So the ability to track is certainly one thing that the organizations need to consider. What are the standards? Are there common standards out there for the metric? Or is it something that will have to be developed internally based on the baseline statistic of where they are currently? And then how comfortable is the company with public disclosure of the measure, not only where they're trying to get, but where they are currently. So it's not an easy process. It's one that many organizations are just starting out on. But certainly creating some form of scorecard would be helpful, something that's tracking various metrics across each of the E, the S, and the G, making sure that the board is aware of, again, the baseline, where they're headed, what's important, what's measurable, and then going forth with the tracking of the metric. Lots of steps to be taken, and certainly not an easy effort for some companies, but I think an important one.
I'll just add a little bit to that. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, these are things that are just the right thing to do. And in some ways, they're almost just table stakes. Running a sustainable business that has a diverse and inclusive workforce with strong governance oversight in and of itself has its own merits that will generate good business. And I think some companies might view this as table stakes, that we should be doing these things well and let's start measuring them. But I don't know that companies are going to necessarily outright pay for them. I'm reminded of a client who got into some legal trouble a long time ago, and they wanted to change their whole culture and make it an ethical and moral culture. And they wanted to put ethics into the incentive plan. And they brought it to me, and I said, wait a minute, we're going to pay people to be ethical? These are table stakes. And I think companies that are going to put this into their incentive plans might view it as table stakes and might structure it more as a penalty, that you must perform well in traditional ways. You must grow, you must be profitable, you must gain market share, and you must do so while being a good citizen as measured by various ES and G metrics. And if you perform well while also doing that, then terrific, you get your bonus. But if you perform well while not meeting these table stakes, you will be penalized. And so I think more companies might consider the modification approach, but mostly downward, that you must be a good citizen. These are table stakes. You will do better with a diverse and inclusive workforce, building a sustainable economic model. And if you can perform well while doing that, terrific. If you perform well while not doing that, well, there's gonna be a penalty.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You can't really reward someone for being ethical, because what does that imply? That you're normally not ethical? I think that's really helpful to lay it out with the step-by-step structure. I'm wondering if you can apply that now to a company, say a company that is super focused on environmental steps, like a utility company that you alluded to several times, Virginia. If you could walk through, say a utility company came to you and said, we want to focus on environmental factors and building that into our compensation plan. Walk them through what are some things that they should think about in terms of, and get as specific as you can in terms of what percentage of should I pay out to environmental factors and things like that. Can you lay out that process as you would working with a client through this?
It's a bit tricky because even within utilities, there are organizations that are focused on different aspects of sustainability. Often what we'll consult around is, first of all, is the metric that you're trying to have your team focused on one that is measurable over a short-term or a long-term period. Often what we find is even if it's a longer-term goal, it's able to be broken up into shorter-term initiatives that give you progress towards a longer-term goal. So in the utility space, for example, many organizations have put forth an emissions reduction goal 20 years out or 15 years out. But they know as an organization what needs to be achieved over the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year period. So we find that many companies will include their sustainability or environmental goal in the short-term plan, even though it's a long-term metric for them. So getting them to think through the measurability over either a shorter or a longer-term period. What is their focus, whether it be renewable energy projects, long-term emissions reduction? Have they received, for example, shareholder proposals on a particular initiative? Do they know that their shareholder base is interested in a certain type of environmental effort? And if so, how are they addressing that internally? And is it something that they may consider including in their incentive plan? For utilities, it's usually pretty straightforward on what metric they're looking for, because oftentimes it coalesces around emissions reduction or renewable energy. So we see those organizations in a bit of a group in terms of things that they're thinking about or focused on. And many of them have made the leap in putting it into their incentive plans. The D&I side is a bit more of a challenge because, again, the tracking is different across companies. What organizations are willing to put out there is different. But there's a lot of different ways to look at that, from employee culture surveys to employee statistics around diversity to what does your pipeline look like and how are you addressing some of the challenges that your workforce is exhibiting in terms of D&I. Supplier diversity is another one. So there's lots of different ways to look at it. And what we always counsel is to have the organization, again, look inward, determine what's most relevant for their business, and then talk about time frame, whether it be short-term or long-term. Figure out whether it's a qualitative assessment or can it be more quantitatively, or can it be approached more quantitatively? And then ultimately, how much weight is put on it? Should it be a smaller percentage of the overall pool, 5%, 10%, or does it modify the core award that's based on the financial goals? So lots of steps to consider. Certainly no one way to approach it. So oftentimes it depends on what the overall structure of the incentive plan looks like, how many measures does it already include, how complex or not is it, and then again, what have they been hearing from shareholders? What is the push?
Mark, did you have anything to add to that?
Determining degree of difficulty for ESG goals is a big challenge, which is why it tends to stay in the discretionary bucket, qualitative bucket. Just knowing how big an effort it takes to meet certain goals is the problem. In some ways, it's easier, but in others, it's not. Like D&I, for example. Putting a goal out there of some specific quota is a very difficult thing to do. It's hard to know what's achievable. And I think companies, when we advise them, it's really, I think, go slow. Unless you're in an industry like you described, there's a few industries where this is really very important and very measurable. And so I'm going to put them aside for a moment. For the vast majority of companies out there, many industries out there, it's a little more difficult to get your arms around what ESG metrics make sense, how hard a goal is. Like I already said, there's this table stakes mentality that could exist. So I think companies should go slow. They should embrace directionality. Let's just be in the right direction in many cases. Let's not overcommit with design features and just keep it directional for now. And as we progress, I think companies, the industry will all get a lot better at understanding what metrics make sense, how hard certain goals will be, and how to think about incentives in a traditional way, because there's an overlay here on setting a goal for EPS where we have years and years of history, a lot of financial analytic tools that we get to use to set reasonable goals. We have all sorts of inputs that we can take to really get at it. That just doesn't exist in this new space.
ESG is a topic that we know investors care about. Part of their charge, however, is to make sure that companies are providing the investment community with enough information to assess the importance of it to their organization, how they're addressing certain areas within it, and ensuring that the disclosure is transparent enough for everybody to be making informed decisions. It doesn't always mean that it has to be in the incentive plan. So I think so many companies are concerned right now that if you aren't paying for it, it doesn't get focused on. I don't think that's the case. And we've seen that for so many metrics. Safety is a great example. Safety is something that's important to every organization, but yet it doesn't find its way into all incentive plans. Ethics is another one, of course. So there's a lot of great managerial initiatives that don't find their way into incentive plans that are critical for organizations. And I think ESG is one of those types of initiatives.
Virginia, that's such an incredibly good point. So you've asked Diana a few times, what are the steps? And I think the first step is, are we going to pay for this? Or are we going to pursue this in a meaningful way outside of the incentive plan? And I think that's literally the very first question. I know you've been looking for steps, so there's one.
I think the answer for many companies is no, we're not going to pay for this. It's something that's of critical importance to the organization. We're going to be transparent as we're able in terms of disclosing what our plan is from an ESG perspective, and everybody in the organization is going to be focused on it. But it's one of those overarching initiatives of every employee that you have to focus on being more sustainable, and you have to understand the importance of diversity and inclusion, and you need to be concerned about your employee engagement or your governance structure, but it may not find its way into many companies' incentive programs.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that point a little more, what are some of the most common ways that companies can incorporate ESG into their business without paying for it?
This gets to business practices, and to some of the earlier points, like we know there's evidence, there's data that a diverse and inclusive workforce produces greater outcome. We know that treating your environment in the community in which you're operating well is key to a sustainable business that long-term investors want to see. So I think it comes down to the management of the company and the operations and the culture. And I could see the incentive coming into play where there's clearly a gap that we need to fill. We know how to fill it. We can measure filling that gap. Happens to be in the ESG space. This will help our business in the long run. Let's build this into our plan for the time being, and so that's one set of companies, and they may put it in an incentive plan. Then there's the other companies who just know this is good practice. They're building it into how they do their work, their efficiency, their workforce, and it doesn't need to be paid for. It could be evangelized culturally within the organization. It could even be part of their external advertising campaign. Many companies, if you watch their commercials, promote ESG type themes. So I think it's probably easier, quite frankly, to promote ESG throughout an organization outside of an incentive plan than it is to promote ESG within an incentive plan. Because now you're paying for something and you need to start measuring it in a more meaningful way because you're putting money there. And in many ways, it's almost more complicated.
And it absolutely starts at the top. The tone at the top is critical. And I think in order for an employee population to understand the importance of ESG to a company, it has to manifest itself in every discussion from the CEO, in every performance management system throughout the organization, drilling down the importance of safety, drilling down the importance of employee engagement and a positive, inclusive culture, ensuring that everyone is making choices that are in the best interest of the organization's sustainability effort. Again, there's lots of management initiatives that can be critical to the success of the company, particularly over the long term, but finding their way into an incentive plan. If you think about it, short-term incentives usually have 2, maybe 3 measures that are attached to them, oftentimes financially focused and primarily financially driven. So having room for another measure without overcomplicating plans has been a challenge that many organizations have struggled with for years because of all the other important initiatives that go on throughout the organization. Having a board and a senior leadership team that drives the importance of the focus on ESG, it will likely go a lot further than carving out 5% of your short-term incentive plan would.
So with all these different ways of incorporating ESG into your organization, when then would it be appropriate for a company to say, we're going beyond the messaging, we're going beyond the advertising, we need to build this into our incentive plan? Is it just when the investors say this is specifically what we want, or are there other factors that can lead an organization to determine that this is something they need to pay for?
It's not just when investors start asking for it. Investors ask for things all the time, and companies will do what they believe is right for themselves and take investor ideas into consideration. I think it really does come down to the company. Like we said first, is this something you want to pay for? If yes, you need to then say, is this going to be an incentive, or is this going to be a penalty? Is this table stakes that you must do these things? Or are we filling a gap and we're trying to improve something under this banner that we can measure and really get our arms around? And I think that's really the key. There's different flavors of building ESG into incentive plans, and you need to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish with this. And again, I think so far, in more cases than not, companies are opting not to put it into the incentive plan. Now, that might be just because they haven't figured it out yet and everybody's trying to, but I do think there are companies who are going to think twice. Going back to my ethics question, do we want to pay for good citizenship, or is it purely expected? And from industry to industry, company to company, it'll have a very different meaning. As Virginia's pointed out, there are industries where this has a lot of meat on the bones. And I think what we see is a lot of other industries where there's not so natural meat on the bones are really grasping at straws. And they're looking to some of these companies at some of their hard metrics on greenhouse emissions. And I have some financial services clients who are like, what are we going to do here? We don't have greenhouse emissions. They resort to D&I and things like that, which are more difficult to measure. And so I think if you're out there and you're thinking about building in an ESG metric into your incentive plan, you have to recognize what kind of company you are and what form it should take, if at all.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. The ESG continuum is broad. There are a lot of things to consider underneath it. There are organizations that put customer service or customer satisfaction under the ESG umbrella. For many companies, that makes perfect sense. Use a net promoter score. For other organizations, it doesn't make any sense at all. Safety is another one. Safety for many companies is life or death. For other organizations, it's certainly a critical component, but may not be as important as it is elsewhere. Environmental and sustainability goals, tougher to measure, tougher to determine what's most appropriate for your company unless you're in those targeted industries, tougher to figure out what message you're trying to send in terms of if you're putting something in your incentive plan, given the multitude of metrics under that umbrella that may be deemed more important for some stakeholders. The people side, a lot to work on here. I put in this category employee engagement, culture, high performance, attrition or lack thereof, a lot to measure, a lot to track. Again, I think part of the challenge that many organizations are struggling with all of this topic is picking which one is most critical, because as you select one, what that may mean to some stakeholders is that the other is not important. So a lot of choices to be made and a lot of things to think about in terms of unintended consequences in doing so.
So for companies that do decide to incorporate ESG into their incentives plan, then how do they go about communicating these changes or updates to their team? And should they anticipate getting pushback or any discontent at this? And how would they handle that sort of pushback?
That would be the same for anything. If you change an incentive plan, change a metric, there's communication efforts, the whys, how is it going to work? How is this going to impact you? In many ways, it wouldn't really change all that much. There's always going to be pushback on different views on the merits of a given metric. I think the difference here is whereas a company might tweak an incentive plan and insert a efficiency measure down in the broad employee population, that's not likely to get any play publicly. But if a company were to put a ES&G metric down in the broad population for a given effort, that could make public disclosure because of its popularity right now and how investors want to see that stuff. And companies are likely to make a big deal out of these metrics more so than they would in other ways to help investors see what they are doing in this space. Investors aren't as in tune to some of the more mundane traditional metrics that may move in and out of an incentive plan in a given year. But if a company is suddenly making a huge effort in some environmental way, I think, one, it will bubble up to the top of the house. I mean, actually, like Virginia said earlier, it starts there. And it's going to get a lot of PR. They're going to play it up outside so that investors see that they're hearing the messages that are being conveyed.
I think one of the challenges around communicating such goals to the extent they make their way into incentive plans, but even if they don't, is ensuring that every employee understands how they can impact the results. So let's take D&I, for example. If you put in a representation type goal, if I'm not in charge of hiring, what is my day-to-day responsibility to help the organization further this effort? So I think it's not just about communicating what the metric is, it's about helping every employee understand how they can impact it.
If you were to summarize all of this into one sentence, if the reader only had one takeaway, what would you want that to be?
ESG is a critical initiative for all organizations, but it doesn't mean that it has to find its way into incentive plans.
The topic of ESG, while it's a new way of talking about things, these are old principles. These are principles that companies have been doing for decades. As long as I've been around and been involved in business, good companies have talked about what does it mean to be a good corporate citizen. They've cared about their employees. They've cared about the environment. They've cared about their communities that they work in and making sure they give back to the community. So these are things that good companies have been doing for a long time. And now it's getting additional attention. And a lot of investors and new investors are asking, what are you doing in these areas? Many companies have been doing great things. And so a lot of it is just making sure that investors understand what's already being done and how does that contribute to the shareholder value of the company. So that's a big part of it. But another kind of question that I think is important to ask yourself if you're a company looking at ESG is, are we questioning putting this in the incentive plan because we want to virtue signal, or are we really trying to drive the business? Because there's an element of, hey, we'd love to take credit for this. We're doing good things, so maybe we can stick it in an incentive plan and we can get some additional credit. And I think that's probably the wrong reason to do this. And if you are going to do, that's where you see these companies do a nominal 5% tied to some sort of ESG metric. They're really just trying to signal that, hey, we're doing the right thing and get credit. But if you've really got, and Virginia and Marc both talked about certain metrics for certain companies that really do help drive shareholder value. And if you have ESG metrics that fall into those categories, that's where it can become a real driver of the business and where you might want to focus on it. But that's not going to apply to every company. So I think that's also a key question. Is this just about virtue signaling, or is this really about driving value in the company? And if so, let's talk about how we incorporate that into the business.
I'll just say, be careful not to be a lemming. Just because everyone's saying to do it doesn't mean you should do it. We saw companies rush to relative TSR many years ago. Everybody ran to it. And in many cases, it wasn't the right move. This has some similarities to that dynamic back then.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Ryan, about the virtue signaling and make sure it's not just like a performative action and that it actually impacts your business. And then when people need some help working through these issues, what is the best way for them to contact you? Is it just through your website, or do you have a dedicated email or phone number?
We probably direct people to the website. And obviously, Marc and Virginia are both prominently displayed on our website. So they can definitely find either of them if they want to there, but probably direct them to our website.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. You can see more about this episode along with additional executive compensation insights at meridiancp.com. That's Meridian, the letter C, and the letter P.com.